Welcome to our first episode. Today we are going to share some background information about our organization and introduce ourselves. Action on Smoking and Health, or ASH as we're known, is the oldest anti-tobacco nonprofit in the U.S. ASH is not anti-smoker, it is anti-tobacco industry. And we have been a leader in this movement since its inception in 1967. ASH remains at the forefront in the fight against the harm caused by tobacco, working both domestically and globally. We're also going to be talking about tobacco endgame today. When you hear the word endgame, you may not immediately associate it with the tobacco control movement. Luckily, we have some experts on our show today that are going to give you a full breakdown of how tobacco endgame works, where it has already been implemented, and how to tell if you're already part of the movement. We now understand clearly that we face an industrially produced pandemic, but these products remain widely sold as though they were normal consumer products. They are not. They are the most deadly consumer products in human history. Today we have Laurent Hubert, Executive Director, and Chris Bostic, Policy Director of ASH. Welcome.
Thank you.
For having us.
Awesome. So I want to just dive right into this, and I'm going to start with Chris. Can you briefly share some of ASH's greatest accomplishments from 1967 through the 90s? Hit us with the greatest hits.
Sure, and that's several decades, so I'll focus on three major areas where I think ASH led the way, and I think we wouldn't be where we are now if ASH hadn't led the way on those cases. The very first one is in the mid-1960s, and even before ASH was incorporated, there was an ASH, and it was run by John Banzhaf, who was the founder of ASH. And he had the brilliant idea of using the fairness doctrine to take on tobacco industry advertisements on television and radio. The fairness doctrine basically says, and it's gone now, it was taken away in 1987, but back then the idea was that the government owns the airwaves, and they give corporations the right to use them to broadcast radio and television. And as part of that, they demand that the broadcasters talk about public interest issues, even controversial issues, but when they do, they have to be even-handed. They can't just show one side of the issue. Now, the tobacco industry was spending, in today's dollars, billions of dollars on tobacco and radio ads for their products, especially cigarettes. And John Banzhaf sued the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to force them to force the TV and radio stations to give time to anti-tobacco messaging. And it was it was so brilliant because the tobacco industry itself went to Congress and demanded that Congress ban tobacco advertisements on television and radio, because they didn't want those free moments for the anti-tobacco movement to get time on the air, because they couldn't afford it. They knew that. And so the reason they wanted the law was they didn't want one tobacco industry to ruin it for everyone else, right? So they made sure it was banned, and that led to the Federal Cigarette Communications Labeling and Advertising Act, or FCLA. And so that took away the biggest marketing tool that the industry had. It's interesting to go back and look. We couldn't do that today without the industry's sort of permission, because this is a First Amendment issue. But because of the fairness doctrine, they had a choice. They could either radio and television stations either had to do this, or they were going to lose their license. So that right away got us going, because some of the groups that had more money than ASH at that point, like the American Lung Association, began to run ads on counter-marketing ads on radio and television until they were all banned. And after that, they paid for them, but they still it got the ball rolling. The next big horizon for ASH was non-smokers' rights and the smoke-free air movement. And in the early 70s, smoke-free air at best meant that you might have a small section of a restaurant that was no smoking. And there could be people smoking 5 feet from you, but it was still considered non-smoking. And aircraft the same way. I'm old enough to remember being on a plane where you're in a non-smoking section, and all the seats in front of you are smoking, but it's a giant aluminum tube contained, and of course you're sucking in smoke the whole time. I got sick every time I flew. So they pushed that forward, and in the 80s they specifically went after commercial airlines to get smoking banned. And it was a long road. At first they got them banned on short flights, because they figured, okay, people that smoke can go for 2 hours without smoking on planes. And then later they said, okay, no, it's 6 hours. It's not fair, because now you have non-smokers who are sucking in smoke for longer periods than the shorter periods. And then eventually they got, in the United States at least, banned on all commercial flights. And later there was an international agreement to do that everywhere. So most of the places in the world, you do not encounter smoking anymore on airplanes. So that was pretty huge, and also gave the tobacco control community some idea of what they could accomplish. So I'll turn it over to you, back to you. But that's the three major things I think that ash is responsible for.
That's amazing, and I think those things are part of our everyday lives now that we take for granted. Which is it's interesting to see the progress that we've made so far, and of course we have many more things to do. But that was the great start of this whole movement. So it was amazing to hear about that. Laurent, can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in tobacco control? I know personally, obviously, you've been in the game for quite a while. And what was the field like when you first joined?
So things were quite interesting. And so I joined ASH in 2000. And that was just the time when the global tobacco treaty was starting to be negotiated. The global community, the world, had realized that we needed a global answer to this transnational epidemic. And at that time, then the treaty for the tobacco negotiations, the tobacco treaty, just were about to begin. And that's when I was hired. And here we're talking about the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And at that time, things were very different, as Chris said, as Chris pointed out. This is a time when the concept of smoke free was considered extremely radical, even within the tobacco control community. We had even NGOs, allies on our field, who thought that was going too far. A smoke free restaurant, a smoke free bar in France, that's impossible. We cannot go that far. And things really changed though over the years. So ASH at that time, what we did is move from working mostly domestically to have a look at it with a global lens. So we went on to have this treaty, which this basically led to an evidence-based treaty that was then adopted by the entire World Health Assembly. So the entire world adopted that treaty, was signed on by most countries of the world, and now ratified by most countries of the world. So ASH took a leading role then in supporting the development of that treaty and the evidence-based measures in this treaty. And we've taken also we put a lot of effort in to see this treaty come to life at national level, so really become a reality on the ground and lead to decreases in smoking prevalence. But unfortunately, that's an area where we see some challenges. So I don't know if you've seen, but just recently, just I think 2 weeks ago, the Lancet released a big report on mortality and morbidity. And unfortunately, the global number of smokers has increased. So if you look from 1990 to 2019, it went from just under 1 billion to 1.4, just under 1 billion smokers to 1.4 billion smokers, I believe. So we've seen, I mean, the increase has been has gone up, unfortunately. So we need to do more to address tobacco. We need to elevate the issue of tobacco, and ASH has done that in addition to the treaty by making sure that tobacco would be integrated at the highest level within the UN agenda, by making sure that, for example, tobacco was front and center in the second high-level meeting on health, which was on non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and chronic lung disease, for which tobacco is a leading risk factor. We were successful in that. We also worked on getting tobacco integrated in the UN Development Agenda, which you know well, in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we were successful in getting this. We also were able to get trade agreements and to look at the issue of tobacco and carve it out from trade agreements. However, despite all of those successes and all of those advances, as I mentioned earlier, progress is inadequate and uneven around the world. So much more needs to be done. And we know there's no silver bullet when it comes to addressing tobacco. We really need to look at all those tobacco measures as a recipe, not as a single silver bullet, as I just said. And within that context, it's absolutely critical that we look at the long-term vision. What do we want to do? Where do we want to be? Do we want to continue to see a world where we have the number of smokers grow? Or even if we're able to get prevalence to a certain levels, what are we comfortable with? And that's where we need to look at further, kind of what's the vision beyond it. And ASH has taken a human rights-based approach, and we've now integrated tobacco within the human rights agenda. And by doing that, we also come to the conclusion, and not only ASH, but even some human rights agencies like the Danish Institute for Human Rights, came to the conclusions that there's an irreconcilable conflict between the marketing and selling of tobacco products and the right to health. Something which is consistent with the FCTC treaty. It's Article 2.1, which calls on countries to go beyond the measures in the treaty to protect the health of its citizens. So much has changed since we started in this, but there's a lot more to be done in order to protect the citizens of the world from the harms caused by the tobacco industry.
Definitely, and all three of us have been part of this journey, for a lot of our careers, and we have seen a lot of change. We have seen a lot of progress, but as you said, unfortunately, the numbers are growing, which is astounding to me because we've felt like we've made a lot of progress, but now we're kind of entering this new phase that I alluded to earlier, where we're not just thinking about policies that are restricting things at the local level or at the country level, but we're thinking really long term, which brings us to this concept of Endgame. So I want Chris to go a little bit more into this. If you could tell us what actually is Endgame and how did ASH transition into an Endgame focused organization?
Sure, and I should probably start by saying that ASH did not invent Endgame. There have been people calling for an end to the tobacco industry for centuries. Pretty much as soon as the tobacco products started appearing on the markets in Europe. One of the most interesting historical anecdotes for me is that at one time the Chinese emperor tried to ban tobacco products because his soldiers were so addicted they were selling their weapons and armor to get it, and he kept having to pay to replace them. It didn't work, of course, because it's very, very difficult to guard borders back then. And the other anecdote I'd like to point out is Luther Terry, who was the Surgeon General that released the original sort of meta-analysis of tobacco and disease and death in 1964, who was himself, by the way, a smoker. When the report was ready to be released, he did so at a press conference on a Saturday, and his reasoning was that he assumed as a doctor that once this was conclusively shown to cause death, which it had been, that government would ban the sale of it. And so he wanted to have it on a Saturday so it wouldn't immediately impact the stock market. He just assumed the stock market would crash because the government would come right back the next day and say, okay, we're going to move to get rid of this stuff. So it's not new at all. ASH is very honored to have the help of a lot of experts in our field who have been talking about Endgame much longer than we have, advising us as we move forward. And ASH's role is sort of to be the shepherd at the national and global level to try to keep this conversation going and enhance it and get more people to think that this is something they ought to be planning for. So that's a lot about that. What about Endgame? So obviously Endgame, very simply, is to phase out the sale of commercial tobacco products. But there's a lot more to it, a lot of lenses to look through. Laurent hit on the human rights lens, and that's how ASH came to it. When you analyze human rights, or the tobacco thing through a human rights lens, and especially when you run it through these things called the Ruggie principles, which is a way that the human rights community deals with third parties like corporations, you end up with two conclusions, and one of them is that this stuff can't be allowed to be on the market. Governments have a duty to protect their citizens from the tobacco industry, from an addictive, deadly product. But the other parts of Endgame are it's a real shift to supply side economics as opposed to demand side. And for decades in the United States and around the world, it's been almost all demand side stuff. It's smoke-free air, counter marketing, higher taxes, no sales to children. It's trying to keep the user from getting hooked on tobacco. And we still need to do that. And that has driven down prevalence rates in many countries in the world, although we haven't managed to stop the flow of new smokers globally. But supply side goes after the tobacco industry itself, and that's quite rare in the past. Endgame is also about viewing people who smoke as the victims, as sort of our clients, and not our opposition. They're not the perpetrators of this. They were almost to the last person addicted as children, and we don't allow children to make decisions about their future. They can't sign contracts. They can't get married without their parents' consent. They can't do a lot of things. They can't vote. But for some reason, we think it's perfectly fine for them to make a lifelong decision of addiction. And I would argue that even an adult can't really make an informed choice on addiction, because there's some things you can't choose. Like I can't agree to be your slave forever, right? So even adults that's problematic. And then the last thing is, I think it's putting health equity at the center of everything. And we have done a great job in the United States of solving the epidemic for sort of white suburbanites, right? We've banned all the flavors that white kids like, and not menthol, which black kids like. But we need to really worry about the populations that are far, far behind. the African American community smokes at a lower rate, but they have a higher incidence of death and disease from tobacco. Native Americans smoke at a much higher rate. The LGBTQ community smokes at a much higher rate because they've been targeted by the tobacco industry for decades. And then the last part of the health equity is that cessation support is vital. We can't solve the tobacco epidemic while abandoning 1.4 billion existing smokers. For so long, it's been only about children, and we should be worried about helping people. There's two stages of prevention, right? You prevent people from starting, but then you prevent them from dying by getting them off of the product. And so that's one of the things we insist on when we work at any jurisdiction. They have to have a plan in place to offer very robust cessation support to their people who smoke. And I think that's Endgame in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people tend to think it's a very out there concept, but we have countries all around the world that are already trying to implement it. New Zealand being one of them, at the forefront of this movement. And slowly, we're going to talk about a little bit more of those jurisdictions later on. But I think this is something that we can actually see in our future, and we just have to work together in order to implement it and to get it to happen. So, of course, we are kind of moving into this different phase of tobacco control. And I want to ask Laurent, as a seasoned veteran in public health, why do you think that this time in your career and this time in this specific Endgame movement is so promising to you?
Well, I think it's a unique opportunity. We have a lot to build on with the development of international treaties that have addressed tobacco. Tobacco is being recognized, increasingly recognized as a development challenge, as a human rights challenge. So I think it provides an opportunity to really try to find an end to this epidemic. And also, if you look at it into the context of COVID, where COVID leads to not only smoking leads to not only worse COVID outcomes, but in addition to that, even in the best of times, smoking really weakens health systems, national health systems, really weakening countries when they're facing pandemics. And this is most likely not going to be the only pandemic that the world faces. And we're already dealing with at the same time, in parallel with the ongoing tobacco-related pandemic. So countries are thinking about this, and they're starting to have at least having a different look and looking at the impact of smoking on the health of its population, but also the economic impact and so on and so forth. So I think it provides an opportunity, and it would be really, really terrible if as a society we cannot achieve a smoke-free world, given that we know the harm those tobacco products produce. And that's a development challenge that the world today that our society should be able to achieve in this century. If not, we're really in serious trouble.
For sure. And I know that ASH is working very closely in California, and you have a specific campaign towards ending the tobacco epidemic in California itself. And California has this whole Endgame plan. So, Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about California's Endgame goals and their vision to end the sale of tobacco products by 2035?
Sure. And as in many things tobacco-related, California is kind of the tip of the spear for Endgame globally. It's not just them. They're not alone. There are people behind them. There's a race. California at first was trying to compete with Finland, who wants to get to 2% by 2040. And then New Zealand muscled their way in a few weeks ago by publishing their proposed plan to implement a bunch of Endgame policies in order to drive down their prevalence to 5% by 2025. We're very fortunate to have had April Ruselier, the head of the California Department of Health Tobacco Control Program, join ASH's Endgame Steering Committee back when we formed in early 2018, because she was already thinking along the same lines and was already planning. And so she's been just a wealth of insights into some of the intricacies of this. It may sound simple to just ban the sale of tobacco products, but it's not quite that simple. And there's a lot of things we need to do, especially in places that still have fairly high prevalence, which there are communities in California that still do as well. California has a rather elaborate goal, the way they phrase it anyways. It's eliminating the structural, political, and social dynamics that sustain the tobacco epidemic. Put simply, that means banning the sale of tobacco products. But they're trying to get local community organizations and local health departments used to the idea and pushing them forward to eventually get there for some, immediately get there for others. They call them trailblazers versus pathfinders. So the trailblazers are folks like Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach, who had a low enough prevalence and the political will to just go ahead and get rid of the sale. But there are several counties, especially in the rural areas of California, where prevalence is triple what it was in Beverly Hills, and they're just not ready. They need to do some other things first. But the idea is to have them put a plan in place so that they can get there, even if it's later. There's a lot of folks that have come up with reasons why California and the rest of the world should not do this, and one of the primary ones is that it'll make a black market, and people will just find their cigarettes somehow else. But I love the way that Ruth Malone, who's an expert on this and also part of our steering committee, puts it. She said that how can we possibly make it worse? I mean, we have 500,000 people dying a year in the United States alone. More people died in a 1 year period from tobacco than COVID. And even if you take the worst part of the COVID epidemic, somehow we've just allowed this to be baked into our existence, into our society. And so we've got to take it down. And California is in the lead, and we're very proud to be a small part of California's efforts.
That's amazing. Yeah, you got to start somewhere. And you mentioned a few of those jurisdictions in California that have already gone ahead and banned the sale of commercial tobacco products. Laurent, can you give us a little bit more detail on that and what progress you've already seen in local jurisdictions? As Chris mentioned, Beverly Hills, Manhattan Beach. Do you have some more insight on some other local jurisdictions that have done it around the country and in California specifically?
Well, there's definitely the successes of Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach, and by the way, both of them won the World No Tobacco Day Award that were recognized for that leadership. But Bloomington in Minnesota, where that city council, I understand, voted 4-2 to end the sale of flavored tobacco products, including menthol, and that will go into January of 22. But they also allows for the sunsetting to an all tobacco license in the city. So that's something that could lead to a place where tobacco is not commercially sold. And the city of Brookline, Massachusetts, also in November of this last year of 2020, passed the Tobacco-Free Generation Initiative, which and by a large percentage, was the standard vote of 139 yes to 73 no, and that would basically ban the sale, phase out the sale of cigarettes to people born after a certain age. So those are positive advances forward. But what I really think is absolutely very, very important is the fact that we have not only entire countries, like for example New Zealand, having put a plan with a very ambitious goal of 5% prevalence or below, but we have also whole regions of the world, the European Union, for example, which is quite kind of a substantial block of countries, has adopted within a context of a cancer plan a target of below 5% of tobacco use. And even recently, France's President Macron stated they would like to see a tobacco-free France. I believe he said by 2030. So that would lead also and all of those statements or commitments towards a smoke-free future and a tobacco-free future will have the momentum moving forward.
Those are some really great examples, for people to look at. And of course, in the United States, things tend to be a little bit more difficult for us at the national level when doing tobacco control. And so sometimes it's easier to go by, incrementally at the local level, whether it's city level or state level. But once you keep chipping at it, eventually, you'll hopefully get there, and hopefully the whole country will end up adopting these policies as well. I want to kind of let people know that even though you may not think that you're doing Endgame, you may already be. This whole concept of Endgame sounds really daunting, and it sounds very aggressive potentially to people who are on the ground and working in their communities right now. But I am certain, having worked in, local tobacco control policy as well, that some of these policies that people already have implemented are part of Endgame. So Chris, can you give us some examples of these common tobacco control policies that cities may already have passed that are examples of working towards Endgame?
Sure, and I think in general, Endgame sits on the shoulders of what we might call traditional tobacco control measures. We can't get to Endgame without driving down prevalence. And a lot of the demand side policies that have been going on for decades have done that. They've driven down prevalence, at least in some areas, enough that we can at least plan for Endgame. I also want to give a bit of background on the Endgame sort of movement in the tobacco control field because it's relevant to your question. There have been meetings focused on Endgame for about 15 years in this country. So beyond just individuals saying we got to get rid of it, there have been some more formalized efforts to discuss it. The difference between that and what we're doing now, what ASH is doing and what California is doing, is that we're not looking for the silver bullet. A lot of those early meetings just argued endlessly about what one policy will finish the tobacco epidemic. And we've come to realize that there isn't one policy, there isn't a silver bullet. The key is to build the political will to get there. And once you've built a political will, we can find a path, and it will be different in different jurisdictions. Just in the United States, as you mentioned, we've had several different approaches to it. The phase-in periods in Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach, the restrictions on licensing in Dozierville and Bloomington, and then, of course, the tobacco-free generation concept in Brookline, Massachusetts. And for those who don't know, the tobacco-free generation is basically raising the minimum age 1 year every year. So it's like a ban with a grandfather clause. Some places around the world have gone further, at least in theory, than the United States, but there hasn't been that much passed yet. I'll first focus on New Zealand. As I mentioned earlier, just published a proposal. The Ministry of Health published a proposal to eradicate tobacco use for the most part. And a bit of backstory there. There's a number of countries called Aspire countries that have set dates and prevalences that they want to get to, and by mostly traditional tobacco control. So I already mentioned Finland, who was going for 2% by 2040. California is going for 1.9% by 2035 to beat Finland, which is great. But New Zealand was the first and the most ambitious. They, in 2015, announced a plan and adopted a plan to get to 5% by 2025. And we're over halfway there already. And several of the lead scientists in New Zealand who were responsible for that plan also sit on ASH's Global Steering Committee for Endgame. And they've been talking to us now for several years, but by the time they'd even gotten on the steering committee, they had looked at the data and realized that they weren't going to make it. That looking at the curves, using traditional tobacco control approaches, they were not going to get to below 5% by 2025. And they were interested in discussing ways to go forward. And so this latest proposal was kind of jaw-dropping from a community health or a public health standpoint. They put everything in the kitchen sink in there when it comes to Endgame. They proposed the tobacco-free generation concept. They also proposed reducing nicotine in cigarettes to the point where it's not addictive. They talked about banning filters on cigarettes. And can you imagine people buying and using cigarettes without filters anymore? I mean, when was the last time you saw one without a filter? They talked about limiting licenses and squeezing them until they're down to zero. We don't know exactly which or any of these will be finally approved by Parliament. But of course, it is a parliamentary system. The Minister of Health works for the party in control, so we're optimistic that they will actually adopt a lot of these things. Some of the other interesting approaches that countries have used, Netherlands, which tried to do this sort of through the courts a few years ago and failed, they've now put a plan in place to restrict the type of places that can sell tobacco over the next 2 or 3 years. And basically giving all retailers notice that eventually they will all have to stop selling tobacco. And so that's an interesting concept. Rather than just the number of retailers, it's number and type. And then Finland had a great idea, which they have not adopted yet, but the idea was to tax cash registers that sell tobacco products and just raise that tax every year until it was no longer economically beneficial for stores to sell tobacco. Hopefully they'll put that in place at some point, but they still have 19 years to go on their goal, so that they'll probably start to realize that they need to do some extra things soon. But just to reiterate, we're not working in a vacuum here in California. It's there's great movement around the world. I know from working at the global level that a lot of people were watching when Beverly Hills set out to pass its ban on tobacco sales, and it has invigorated people around the world. We've talked to coalitions in many countries that want to know how they can do this too.
That's amazing. Of course, it just takes one jurisdiction to kind of get the ball rolling, and then other people see that they can do it too. Whether it's a small city like Beverly Hills, which is fairly, not that large, but they still did it, and then other cities take note, and other countries take note, and then they want to get involved in it as well. Laurent, you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add to Chris's statement is that a lot of those policies that are now be considered a bit extreme or a little bit, extreme forward thinking. But that was true for almost every single tobacco control policy, which is now considered totally normal. So smoke,
Mm-hmm.
for example, being able to take an airplane without having to be subjected to smoke through the entire flight. That was considered a radical approach not that long ago. So first, I think that's a very, very important point because all of those endgame measures could become, what we think now is endgame could become totally the norm in a few years. And then the second point also that Chris also pointed out again is that the fact that, there's no silver bullet and we know we have to implement all of the evidence measures we already have at our disposal, tax and price, advertising bans, packaging and labeling that's appropriate, that deters people from smoking, and all of the end-game policies that will really restrict sales and the commercial sale of tobacco products. And at the same time also implement the measures we do know work to address the illicit trade of tobacco products. And let's not forget that the tobacco industry itself has been implicated in illicit trade of tobacco products. So they have at times been implicated in that process. But there are tools in place, including an international treaty that has been negotiated and entered into force on that issue. So as countries implement those policies, they also have all the tools to address the illicit trade of tobacco products.
Of course, yeah. There's many things that still need to be done as well. Chris, you want to add something?
Yeah, I should have mentioned this before, but it's just one indication of where things are going. When Ash set out to start doing this about 6 years ago now, and we work around the world, so we talked with our colleagues everywhere, with literally many hundreds of people. And at that point, the general reaction was, okay, that's nice, you guys go do that. Because it was just so crazy that we're going to go do real tobacco control if you guys want to go do that. But today, we're constantly shocked to hear that of conversations going on in countries and in regions where endgame is a natural topic. It's always part of the agenda now when people are talking about the tobacco epidemic. And that alone is just amazing because what we want people to do, of course, is plan for endgame. And they can't plan for it unless they're aware of it and talking about it within their coalitions.
That's for sure. And, like Laurent said earlier, things that we did, 10, 15 years ago seemed like crazy town. When New York City went smoke free in bars and restaurants, they said, oh my goodness, no tourists are ever going to come back to New York. We're going to lose so much tourism business, in restaurants and bars. And then turn around and they did better than ever because everyone wanted to be in a smoke-free environment and they wanted to be able to breathe and they wanted to be able to feel like they could enjoy themselves. And so things like that, where people thought things were completely out of range, then became that were completely welcomed by the public. And so I'm glad to see that around the world, things that we thought were maybe a little bit crazy in talking about endgame, even in my short career in tobacco control, we thought endgame was only for those who were really, really gutsy and risky. But now fast forward a few years and you have entire countries creating proposals and plans and targets to achieve these goals, which is an amazing, amazing achievement. And so we got to keep inspiring other jurisdictions locally and nationally. And I think that eventually, if we work together, we'll get there. So I just want to thank you both so much, Laurent and Chris, for being here today and for sharing Ash's rich history, your experience in Endgame thus far, and how people can work toward ending the sale of commercial tobacco products in their communities. We look forward to hearing from more advocates who are working on this in exciting work. We look forward to hearing from more advocates who are working on this exciting work in future episodes. So please, everyone, stay tuned, and we're going to be releasing a lot more exciting content. And thank you so much for joining us today.